Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a calm and relaxing weekend. A few things before I begin today's topic. First of all, I sent you a link last week for the second survey task that you have to complete. The deadline for that is that Wednesday. So on Wednesday at midnight, you have to submit the survey by then. Similar to the first survey, not too complicated. All you have to do is read through everything and answer seriously and honestly based on your opinion. If you were worried that you're answering those surveys for nothing or just for your 5 points for that matter, then for the lecture that I'm going to record later this week for Wednesday, you will see some of the results from um, the previous survey that you filled in a few weeks ago. So that's one thing. The other thing, this week is spring break week. Well, there's not much of a spring break at the university, unfortunately for all of us. There is spring break for the other education system across the country, across the state list, and my kids are home. So that means that I will not have the regular office hours this week on Tuesday and Wednesday. If you do need to talk to me this week, send me an email and we'll set up a time that we can talk. So there's no problem about that. And of course, because the only relevant spring break that the university has is Friday, we also do not have a Friday meeting. So that's one more thing. Finally, thinking a little bit ahead, you're done with the midterm paper this weekend, and good for that. I want you to start thinking about the final paper. There's still time. There's about a month and a half, almost 2 months until you have to submit the final paper and presentation. But by the end of this month, you have to talk to me about it so we can confirm your topic. So make sure you start thinking about that, what topic you want to write about. If you want to write not by yourselves, with other people, you also have to start thinking about that. So make sure you're beginning to put this as part of your mindset. Okay. This week we begin a new topic, which is from this week forward till the end of the semester. Essentially, we'll talk about talk a little bit more in depth on different elements that's related to some of the theories we talked about. The theories that I've mentioned in all the previous lectures, they will serve as the foundations, and then we'll talk about additional things. So today we'll talk about democratic peace. I'll get to that in a second. Now it works. So just a quick reminder, although it's not directly relevant to what we talk about today, on Wednesday of last week, I finished the discussion about international institutions by talking mostly about different treaties and agreements, focusing first in the first half of the lecture on the alliances, the importance of the content and the type of alliance as a signal to compensate for the problem of credible commitment. Then we showed the effect that different types of alliances has on the probability of conflict, if the probability is higher or lower, depending on the type of alliances or the type of agreement that is signed between participants. We talked about the question of how many concessions are needed to be provided in order to reach this kind of agreement and how that affects the relationship. And then different other elements and different other types of treaties in the context of international security, such as arms control and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, how that affects the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and then treaties in the context of economic policy, and also the effects of international organizations, such as why and the benefits that an organization such as the World Trade Organization provides in terms of benefits to those that go through the accession process. If you have any questions about that, you are, as always, more than welcome to email them to me or to come to office hours next week, and we can talk about that. Okay, so this week we begin talking about one of those more specific theories of foreign policy on some level, what's called the democratic peace theory. This is a theoretical framework that relies on liberal, structural, and institutional foundations and is intended to explain the more unique type of relationship that exists between democratic countries and why do we observe those kinds of things. So speaking about observation, one of the most famous ways to describe the democratic peace theory is a lot of scholars and researchers have called that an empirical regularity in search of a theoretical foundation. Why that? Because from an empirical standpoint, from what we observe in the world, this point is valid. Democratic countries do not go into conflict. However, the theoretical logic behind explaining why is that the case is still not clear. So let's break it down a little bit more. Overall, research on types of regimes has consistently shown that democracies are just as war or conflict prone as non-democracy, which means democracies will go to wars overall just as countries which are not democracies. However, when democracies face another democracies in a dispute or any kind of disagreement about issues, they tend to refrain from violent clashes. So again, starting to understand why is that the case. This empirical finding is very, very interesting because it motivates us to think about the foundations of regime and whether those foundations, those elements, those mechanisms within the way that regimes are structured affect the way that those countries behave in the international system. In essence, what we wonder is whether democracies have inherent aspects which are different than non-democracies and make them less willing to fight other democracies which are similar to them, right? So what this actually background offers us is that means that we need to study the causal mechanism within democratic countries and see how they drive those kinds of outcomes. What are the causes of the democratic peace? Why don't they affect the relations that democracies have with non-democracies? So I'm going to give you a set of different variations of this theory, and each one of them provide us sometimes very different, sometimes relatively similar types of explanations. The first is the liberal view. According to the liberal view, the modern liberal states have two types of characteristics. The first is that its foreign policy towards other liberal states is peaceful. For example, we can think about the relationship between the United States and Britain since the Reform Act, which was signed in 1832. Since then, both the United States and Britain had a lot of grievances and disputes between them, but all of those were resolved by a peaceful manner through negotiation and not through conflict. Right? So this is one characteristic between those countries. The other is that liberal states tend to display an imprudent type of policy or an imprudent type of relationship with non-liberal state, and that's in the sense that wars are viewed as a defensive act by liberal countries because they are attacked by non-liberal countries, right? So this is the second type of behavior. So they do engage in wars with this non-liberal state, but that is intended in order to secure their defense. Now, overall, this view heavily relies on the work that was presented by the political philosopher Immanuel Kant. His Perpetual Peace, written in 1975, presents a theory of international relations which describes the ethical and liberal foundations of these types of peace. And it explains why liberal states tend to be pacifistic mode to one another and why they are not behaving in that manner when they face non-liberal states. So some of the arguments that he made there that explains this kind of this outcome is that in liberal states, society in those states solve issues related to moral autonomy or individualism and social order by preserving the judicial freedom and on the basis of a representative government with separation of power. So all the elements we see in liberal states are allowing those kinds. This is some of the foundation. Now, laws in those kinds of countries are set by individuals and their representatives. Because individuals set laws that they have to comply with, there is no issue of immorality in those laws, and it should not lead to tyranny. So again, this is some of the foundations that seeks a more representative government, which understands the importance of following laws. Now, liberal states create a union of countries which display those kinds of peaceful relations, and it comprises all the liberal state, and all of them accept those kinds of relationships and preserve the rights within those states and between those states. And this union, which is described in some levels as a kind of a federation, expands slowly to other states around the globe. And finally, those countries, while they preserve their laws within their own borders, they also work very hard to establish a cosmopolitan types of laws that operate in conjunction with this union of states. And those laws are intended to describe conditions for universal hospitality, especially when it comes to foreigners trying to establish trade relations with the locals. So how to establish this exchange of ideas between members of liberal countries based on this cosmopolitan law. Wars, by that definition, is also based on the way that we view peace. So the French Revolution was a very important part by description that Kant provides us. It was important to his argument about the cosmopolitan views that can spread around and change society. So according to that idea, peace is an ethical duty of those kinds of people. However, wars and conflict are still part of the discussion because they're part of the process. Why? Because engaging in a conflict or a war, according to that view, presents a learning opportunity for the values of peace. So we view the cost of war, and that provides us an understanding of why peace is valuable. So at the same time, despite the ethical and moral foundations of this argument that explain why peace is the ethical duty, the factors, according to Kant, that drive this peaceful behavior between liberal countries are mostly associated with the negatives of war, which includes fear, the use of force, and that leads to greater emphasis on the benefits that individuals understand why wars are not an optimal solution. So again, war is a negative outcome. It provides us with a negative cost, and that drives us emphasizing the benefits of not engaging in wars. As individual rights takes center stage and they become more important, the conduct of war between, in this case, liberal states is less likely because the citizens themselves have to accept that, and they have all the motivation, the incentives not to accept that. And so this kind of an approach, when a liberal state faces other liberal states, leads them to adopt a more of hesitated approach in terms of engaging in a conflict or aggressive actions towards other liberal states. And if wars will take place between those kinds of countries, which is very unlikely, that's going to be intended to promote freedom and the protection of private property. However, when liberal states face non-liberal states, then wars are viewed as an obligation, because this is intended to convince the non-liberal states that they need to be part of this union of liberal states. That's the idea behind that. This political aspect or political view of the liberal variant on some level of democratic peace also has a material aspect to that, and that relates to the economy. And that completes this condition. That's the need to promote commerce, which cannot happen properly under conflict, right? A lot of this liberal view is based on liberal economic theory. And reminding you, when I talked about that, when I talked about political economy, according to liberal economic theory, comparative advantage is one of the important drivers of international cooperation, international trade. So in order to maximize the interest of all the relevant actors, we have to also accept this kind of view when it comes to the relations between states. Okay, another related aspect that is mentioned by Kant is a more direct explanation for why liberal states are less likely to engage in wars. And that is that citizens in liberal states are the ones who are most likely to pay the cost of war, whether it is human cost because they are either the soldiers or family members of soldiers that may die in war or get horribly, severely injured, or the financial cost because somebody has to pay for that war. Therefore, those citizens have incentives, or they refuse to select or support representatives or politicians that engage in those kinds of actions. As a result, the politicians themselves have incentives to refrain from conflict because they want, first and foremost, as I said multiple times over the last few weeks, to ensure their survival. I want to win the elections as a politician. I know that members of the public in my country do not support engaging in conflict. So I would not adopt those kinds of policies, right? So that's the foundation of the liberal view in this case. The main problem of this approach is the weak empirical evidence, especially for the most relevant historical time that is being studied, and that's all the way from the beginning of the 19th century all the way to 1965. The research that have relied on those theories and did an empirical analysis could not find the expected negative association between a democratic country and engaging in wars. So this is one. The other aspect in this case, and that's what was mentioned by a lot of others that criticize that view, is that it heavily relies on the rational choice approach and the importance of economic aspects. It still ignores from a lot of intangible aspects that drive our behavior, as I talked about in our political psychology lecture, and non-economic objectives, which relate to ideology, prestige, status, reputation, and similar aspects to that. One more thing that this approach ignores heavily is the importance of the domestic institutions and the domestic effects. So now let's develop it a little bit further and talk about other variants of the liberal view. The first is the normative view, which is in a way very close to the liberal one that I just talked about. According to that view, domestic norms are an essential part of the state and its institution, and therefore it shapes its behavior. So a lot of it is the foundations of liberalism, as I talked about at the beginning of the semester. Now, one of the important norms that are pushed in democratic countries is that political competition, any type of disagreements and competition, are resolved through compromise, and there is a very strong push to promote standards of living, of including stability and compromise in the relationship between countries. On the other hand, non-democracies, the norms that are accepted in those kinds of countries are exactly the opposite. Any kind of conflict is viewed as a zero sum. Either I win or my rival win. We cannot compromise on that. Therefore, all conflicts are addressed by using coercion and violence, which by itself creates in those non-democratic countries standards of fear and mistrust between individuals. This approach, as I said, because it's heavily related or close related to the theory of liberalism, also views the international system, the world, as an anarchy. Now, in this kind of a system, the survival of states is key, and this is where it's very close to liberalism, and where it's diverged a little bit is that in order to explain the behavior of states according to that explanation, the normative view of the democratic peace, that is heavily reliant on the norms. So countries will behave according to the norms that are displayed by the rival. So reciprocity, which I've mentioned also in the last couple of weeks multiple times, is very important. I, as a democratic country, will behave in the international system based upon the norms that are most likely to be displayed by my rival or my adversary for this conflict. So in this case, when two democracies have a dispute, they will operate based on the democratic norms, which I've talked about, compromise and stability and those kinds of issues. And they will refrain from any type of violent conflict. However, when a democracy faces a non-democracy, it will reciprocate to the norms of the non-democracy, right? So that increases the odds of violence. That's the idea behind the normative view. And that's why it explains why democratic countries will not engage in conflict with one another, especially because they share those norms. So when they face any types of disputes between them, they're more likely to behave according to those norms. A different explanation or a different variant of this is what's called the structural view. The main point here is focusing on the process of going into war, which the argument is a lot slower in a democracy, right? And what happens is because this process of going into war in democracy is a lot slower, diplomacy takes center stage in this phase. It can mitigate a lot of the problems or the disagreement and resolve the disputes with no violence. And this is much more likely, of course, when two democracies face one another. And some of the reasons for that include the fact primarily that when we think about the structure of democratic regimes, any types of action which in the international system, primarily international disputes, require the leaders of those countries to mobilize the support of the public, as well as different domestic institutions such as the cabinet, the legislature, different interest groups. All of them have to support the policy so the leaders can enact that. Because there's a lot of different aspects of society or the political system that have to support this kind of policy, it reduces the justification of violent clashes for all these actors. Very hard to find common ground among those many multiple actors and make sure that all of them support those kinds of actions. And that means that mobilization by the public in terms of its support and actual mobilization of going into war will be much more of a challenge, going to be much slower. It is also means, of course, that leaders will be less open of going into engaging in those kinds of conflict, except in a very emergency situation or highly justifiable conditions. And lastly, democracies from a structural standpoint have a set of clear constitutional and legal constraints, which makes mobilization into war and recruiting the support of the public or different institutions much, much harder. Compare that to non-democracies where leaders are not dependent on so many groups in society or within the political system that needs to support those kinds of policies. So it makes it much easier to leaders of non-democracies to engage in violence when they have to address disputes. So that's the idea behind the structural view. Now, in reality, when you think about those two variations of the theory, the models share a lot of predictions regarding the outcomes. It's very hard to it's sometimes hard to distinguish between them, especially in the context of the potential of participation, of the support of the public, and the support for conflict. Two of the potential differences between those two variants. The first is when we focus on the normative aspect, norms are slower to develop, which suggests that, as part of the explanation, older democracies are more likely to refrain from fighting one another because they had a lot of time to let those norms sink in and have an effect, while new democracies are lower in this end. They are maybe more likely to engage in those kinds of conflict because the norms that are preventing them from going into conflict with other democracies are still in the process of taking hold. So while new democracies, the norms are still not powerful enough to prevent them from going to war to other democracies, in established and old democracies, they are much stronger. So that's one point. From a structural standpoint, we need to understand, and I've mentioned that, the importance of variations in the different structures of democratic countries. So we have presidential system and coalition system or parliamentary system. Each one of them have different sets of constraints on the actions of leaders. Reminding you, for example, when I talked about the effect of domestic institutions on international behavior, the difference between a coalition government, how constraining it is in terms of going into conflict compared to a presidential regime. So those two models are tested in one of the papers you had for today, the Maus and Russet, which was one of the first papers that engage in an empirical assessment of different explanations of the democratic peace. They they collect data on dyads in conflict and crises between 1946 and 1986. And one of the challenges they faced that early on is that from an empirical standpoint, we need to try and think about, how do we measure those kinds of things? How do we measure a democracy? So one of the most famous measures that I've mentioned a couple of times, the POLS score. The POLS score on some level is based on assessing the degree of competitive and political participation within countries, the openness of recruitment in the political system, the regulation of participation, and the extent of executive constraints. And what we have here are different values, which I've talked about, anywhere between -10 and 10, to represent the level of the regime. So for example, the United States is at 10 as a democracy. This is from 46 all the way to 2013. France was also relatively high. It had a dip during the 1950s when it faced the civil war in Algeria, and there was a lot of instability within the regime. On the other hand, we have here two non-democracies as Iraq and Nigeria, and as you can see, their values are, the zeros stand somewhere around here. If it's very small, so I'm not sure you can see. And you can see this changes here. For example, for Iraq, the jump here is around 2003 to 2004 after the American invasion and toppling the regime of Saddam Hussein and instituting a new, some sort of new democracy regime, which has changed a lot since then, but that was reflected in this specific measure. Other measures that were used, for example, to assessing for domestic violence, we can measure the number of political related deaths or executions, changes in the economy, which is also part of the explanations, and how do we measure norms? So this is some of the challenges they face in one of those, in this study, which was very important because it was one of the first empirical tests of this theoretical framework. So some of their findings overall, they find that democracies are less likely to participate in militarized disputes. They find support overall for both the models, but much more evidence for the normative view. Okay, so I have mentioned how the liberal aspect or the liberal variant and the normative explanations are sharing a lot of points that are very close to one another. Now I want to talk about another variation of democratic peace, which is called the institutional version. And it's a little bit closer to the view that Maus and Russet has introduced regarding the structural foundations of democratic peace. So this is the other paper, I'm sorry, you had for today, the Bueno de Mosquita paper. It presents, first of all, it expands overall. When we think about that, it expands on the institutional foundations of the democratic peace, focusing on the institutions themselves. It allows us to explain that one of the main benefits of this model is that it goes beyond what Maus and Russet provided from a structural standpoint, that it provides us ways to explain questions about the actions of political leaders, not just leaders of democracies, and how that relates to the most important assumption or the most important motivations for those political leaders, which is their own political survival. Everything in their actions are based on that, right? And the main benefits that their model provides us is that we can use that model to explain the behavior of not just democracies, but any type of leader. So one of the important motivations for their research is the problems with the existing explanations. Primarily, is that the normative and the existing structural explanations cannot explain all the irregularities that relate to democratic peace. So, for example, when it comes to the normative explanation, the one problem we can think about is that it is described in an ad hoc manner, which means we observe in reality that there's no wars between democracies. Therefore, we assume or we build on that to argue that the reason is because those two countries share norms which are present in them. So because the United States and Great Britain do not go into wars, now we see, oh, right, they have similar norms, and that's what drives the aspect. And that's a very problematic point to argue from a causality standpoint, because we have to establish, in order to make this an explanation, a scientific, valid explanation, there is a clear causal link, that the explanatory factor that for the normative view, this is the norms, that's what leads to the outcome, no wars, and not the other way around. So that's one point. The second point also relates to the empirical record of this view, and that's asking, when democratic states over the course of history resumed or engaged in conflict against weaker states and implemented their imperialist conquest, where were the effects of norms? Those norms of compromise and stability, why did it not have an effect in their relationship with other countries? That's one set of problems. When it comes to the structural point, overall, they suggest that the structural explanation is logical and makes sense, but it should be valid for all types of wars, not just for wars between democracies. And the empirical evidence does not support the logic of this structural approach. So instead, they build on the structural explanation and develop it even further by presenting what I've already presented a few times in the last couple of weeks, which was the selectorate theory. Selectorate theory provides us with a framework that offers a formal representation of the political institution in any types of country. And we can use that to derive hypotheses on the behavior of the leaders of those countries in multiple types of contexts. For our focus is foreign policy and conflict, but I've mentioned that we can use selectorate theory to talk about economic types of policies, such as sanctions and foreign aid. So this is one of the main benefits of that. It provides us with a very general types of theoretical explanation to look at to try and understand different events that happen in over history. So first of all, reminding you on the basics of selectorate theory, if you don't remember from the previous lectures. First concept within the theory, what's called the selectorate. It is described as the S factor, and when they talk about it in the model, the selectorate includes all members of society that participate in the political voting process, that they can choose their leaders. So for the United States, all adults which have the rights to vote are members of selectorate. The important element within the selectorate is what's called the winning coalition, the W. The winning coalition is a subset within the selectorate, within the overall society, that is the majority that the leader, the politician, has to secure in order to win the elections or secure its incumbency, right? So the American system is not a very direct representation of that, because we have the electoral, the using of the electors. But if we rely on the fact that President Biden has won the popular vote in the 2020 elections, then we can say that for the 2020 elections in the United States, the selectorate is all voting adults within the United States. Everybody that voted is part of the selectorate. The winning coalition is the at least 51% that President Biden was able to secure in order to win office, if that was the only condition. Now there's the electorals here, so it's a little different, but overall, try to think about that in that sense. If a leader of a democracy can secure at least the majority of the votes to win the elections, that's the winning coalition, all right? But here, and that's what I've mentioned, the idea of the regime time, this is where regime time matters for this kinds of theory, because, as I said, in a democracy, the winning coalition is very, very large. Biden had to secure a very large amount of votes in order to win the elections, or former President Trump had to secure a lot of votes in order to survive in office. On the other hand, when we think about non-democracies, the winning coalition, as I mentioned when I talked about that in the previous lectures, is much smaller, because the leader only relies on a very small circle of supporters. We can think about single party dictatorships such as we can think about North Korea. The leader only has the support of the party behind him. Monarchies or military regimes, when it's also a very small circle of military officers which control the country. So this is a much smaller coalition. The leaders in those countries only need to secure the support of those individuals in order to survive in their position. So another thing that I've already mentioned, but I'll make a quick review about it so we can understand it much better. How do leaders secure the support for their from members of the electorate? So they do that by providing different types of good, different types of benefits to their supporters. There's public types of good and there's private types. I've talked about that already, so I'll mention it. I'll review it once again. An example for a public types of good is national security. All members of society can share that good equally. A private types of good is some types of benefits it's giving to one member of society and it cannot be given to the others. It's a more of a limited amount of resources. Overall, the argument when it comes to those two different types of regimes, because leaders of democracies need to secure a much larger winning coalition, it does not make a sense for those leaders to provide private goods because resources are scarce. They cannot provide every members of the winning coalition the same financial or political benefits in this case, so they provide public goods. On the other hand, leaders of non-democracies have to secure only a very smaller coalition of people so they can provide direct economic, financial, political benefits to those members, and then they secure their position, right? So this is just quick review on selectoral theory. Let's put that into the context of conflict. During an international disputes, leaders have to choose how much of the resources that they have they can devote to the conflict compared to any other purposes that they have. And all that, again, based on the argument that they need to survive in office. Now, the question that the essential question that comes into play here is how much effort are the leaders are going to invest in winning the conflict. And again, this is where we diverge between different types of regimes, but we need to think about how does the conflict represent a good for the members of the public, the members of the winning coalition. The outcomes of the conflict, according to that theory, is viewed as an important part of their decision whether to retain the leaders or not. So the outcomes of the conflict are the rewards, are the goods. If we're going into a conflict with another country and we're winning the conflict, that's the reward that if I'm the leader and I won the conflict, that's the reward I provide to the citizens, and they will decide whether to keep me in my position or not, right? And now let's think about it in the context of different regimes and the different types of winning coalitions. For democratic leaders, because they provide because they provide a public good, any policy failure, because that's relevant to everyone, that's the good that they provide to their citizens, any policy failure is a lot more of a problem for their political survival. It doesn't matter if it's policy in the context of economic policy, social policy, or any policy they want, and we're talking about foreign policy. If I'm failing in the foreign policy that I'm enacting, I cannot provide any benefits or any rewards to my supporters if I'm a leader of a democracy, right? If I'm a country a democracy going into war with another country, it doesn't matter the regime right now for that discussion, and I'm unable to win the conflict, I cannot provide any rewards, and it's possible that I'm going to lose the supporters. So that means that leaders of democracies are more likely to invest a lot more resources and an effort in winning the conflict, because that's the only thing that I can provide to my supporters to show them that this policy was a success. You should keep me in my position, right? It also means that if I'm the leader of a democratic country, I'm more likely to go into wars, only the ones that I think I'm going to win. If I'm a leader of a small democratic country, let's say something in the Pacific Ocean, and I have conflict with another country, if I don't think that I'm likely to win the conflict, I'm not going to go into that war, right? Because I'm going to fail. The policy is going to fail. I'm going to lose my position. I'm not going to survive in office. So that's democracies. On the other hand, here we have a collection of our most favorite autocrats over the last 100 years or so. Leaders of those kind of regimes, reminding you again, rely on a very small winning coalition. So they usually tend to provide private goods to those supporters. So they provide financial or political benefits to their supporters. As long as the leaders of those autocracies or dictatorships can provide those goods, they're at no risk of losing office. And as a result, when they face an international dispute, those disputes are much less an inflection point for their survival. They can lose the international disputes, but as long as they can still provide the financial, material, political benefits to their supporters, they will remain in their position. What it also means is the dictators, leaders of non-democratic countries, will invest less resources in the conflict, right? Because it doesn't matter if they win or not, they're gonna, as long as they can provide the private benefits to their supporters, they will remain in office. And that has a strategic aspect on a non-democracy facing a democracy, because I just mentioned to you that leaders of democratic countries are likely to invest a lot of resources in the conflict. On the other hand, leaders of non-democratic countries are likely to invest a lot less resources. So by design, the likelihood that the non-democracy will win a conflict with a democracy is much lower because they invest less resources. All right? Now, let's link all that back to a dispute between two democratic countries and our theory of democratic peace. If we imagine two democracies in a dispute, the leaders in both of those countries understand all the dynamics that I just talked about, the incentive structure for investing a lot in this conflict in order to win the war, because it's the only way that I can survive in office. So because if I'm the leader of country A, a democracy, I'm facing a dispute with country B, also a democracy, I understand I have to invest a lot in order to win, otherwise I will lose my position. But I also understand from a strategic standpoint that the leader of country B, my rival, also faces the same kind of risk, the same types of incentive structure. So if we think about it from a rational standpoint, the best solution for us will be to resolve our disputes peacefully before we invest a lot of resources and engage in a conflict that our probability of winning is relatively much lower, right? Because both of us are democracies. That's the idea behind it. And that's the main benefits of this, putting the democratic peace under the prism of selectorate theory. Thinking about it from a rational standpoint, when I'm thinking strategically on my incentive structure and the incentive structure of my rival, we should come to a conclusion, as Fearon talked about, that it's much better for us not to invest in the conflict and waste all our resources, engage in those costs, because we may lose our position. Okay? And that's why, according to that theory, democratic countries will not engage in war with one another. So thus far, I have presented many different types of variations of or aspects of those theories. And in some cases, there is some similarities between them. Some cases, there's no consistency among them. And that has led, as you can probably expect, to a lot of criticism. And that's what I want to talk about now. Why it is important to assess that. First, from a scientific standpoint, we need to understand what are the weaknesses of those kinds of theoretical explanations. But I want to focus on the more practical aspect of it. A lot of the policymakers, especially in the 1990s and the early 2000s, have used those foundations, the logic of democratic peace, to drive their foreign policy approach. George W. Bush famously talked about the need to expand the number of democracies in the world in order to promote global peace, or at least to secure the United States. So the democratic peace theory has served as an important foundation in the foreign policy approach of the United States, at least it's part of its history. So at least we need to know if all those different variations of the same theory, which provide us not consistency in the empirical evidence, is it actually true? Maybe not. I'm going to focus on the criticism that was presented by Christopher Lane, who was, I'm not sure if he's still there. He was a professor at the Bush School at Texas A&M. And he presented the criticism of the theory, the misfit with the international system. The focus that he talks about is the theory causal logic. And he also presents an alternative explanation. In this case, he's focusing on realism as a much better predictor. Quick reminder regarding the point of the realism. A realist view focuses on interest and the strategic concerns of the actors in the international system. When two actors facing a dispute, the issue at stake, it's critical. Any actor is liable to engage in threats, ultimatums, costly actions. And the most important factor that drives the behavior of those actors, according to the realist view, is the military balance of power and the balance of interests. Okay, so in order to provide support for his argument that a realism provides a much stronger explanation, sorry, much stronger explanation to the lack of wars between democratic countries than the democratic peace theory, he tests four historical cases and shows the dominance of the realism. And I'm going to talk about all four of them. Those cases represent historical events where two democratic countries, strong democratic countries, were right on the verge of going into war. Before we go in this quick historical detour to talk about those examples, I will stop for today's attendance word. The attendance word for today is the word break, as in spring break, even though we don't really have that. So break is the attendance word for today. The main point of criticism that Lane emphasized is that if we follow the logic of democratic peace, and we argue that democracies rely on public opinion and public views of the conflict to drive their behavior, then democracies should be less war prone, against any type of regime, not just against other democracies, right? We cannot use the effect that the public has just to explain why democracies don't fight one another and not use that to explain why democracies do fight non-democracies. If the cost of war are that much of a burden from a human as well as economic standpoint, why does it matter if the United States fights Iraq or if the United States fights France? That's the point that he's trying to make. The first case is the Trent Affair, which took place during the American Civil War. It describes an intensification of tensions between the Union, the United States, as well as the British. It took place, of course, during the Civil War. The crisis, the Trent Affair itself, emerged when the USS San Jacinto intercepted the Trent, which was a British mail ship, but which was neutral at the time. And in addition to just intercepting it off the coast of the eastern seaboard of the United States, they also arrested two Confederate Army officials that were on board. They were James Mason and John Slidell, if you are interested in those historical details. Now, beyond that specific incident, the tensions between the two sides were based also on the fact that the British were very concerned with the blockade on the northern ports, as well as the limited access that the British had to the cotton industry in the South during the Civil War. So that was the concern that fueled those kinds of tension. Now, a little bit on the details that took place during the crisis itself. The British public, when they learned about that incident, responded with a great anger. And it was described in the newspapers as war fever among the British public. It was viewed as a violation of international laws. And there was a lot of pressure laid out on the British government to make threats and go into the war preparations. For example, this is the points made by the British Prime Minister at the time that showed a very strong public sentiment toward responding to that conflict and not accepting what they viewed as the American aggression. Now, let's talk about the American side here, the Union. The Union faced multiple challenges at the time because of the Civil War. Nevertheless, the public in those states, in the Union states, was displaying clear anti-British sentiment. A lot of it was driven by the fact that the British has declared to be neutral in the Civil War, and that was viewed by public members in the northern states, in the Union states, as a de facto recognition of the southern states. So there was a strong push by the public not to concede and to oppose the British in this case. However, by the end of 1861, mere few months after the Trent incident itself, the United States conceded in the crisis, which meant that the Confederate Army officers were released. And there was an official admission that the operations of the USS San Jacinto was without official directive from Washington, and an overall apology by the United States. Now, according to Lane's alternative explanation, he argues that that was a realist view. Why? Because according to the evidence that he proposes in the paper, one of the central concerns that President Lincoln faced at the time was understanding that the Union cannot fight wars on two fronts. They cannot fight the civil wars, which consuming most of the resources that the Union states had, as well as fighting the British in another front. And if we think about that, we think about fronts, military capabilities, resources. This is a textbook realist view based on the balance of power, right? We cannot use arguments that are more prevalent for democratic peace, such as shared norms. The fact that the United States or the Union States and the British had some shared norms cannot have an effect on it. Even more than that, if democratic peace is mostly reliant on the effect of the public, we see here in evidence that both the British public as well as the public, the American public, was very much in favor of going into conflict. So that cannot be, according to Lane's argument, the explanation for why war was averted. War was averted between the Union States and the British because of realist incentives, the balance of power primarily, right? So that's one case. The other case is the crisis in the Ruhr, which took place in the early 1920s. It was tensions between France and Germany that erupted to a small-scale violent incident in the Ruhr region, which I'll show you on a map in a second if you're not familiar with the composition of Northern Europe. And those violent incidents took place after the French occupied the region in 1923. So again, a little bit of the background. Since the end of World War I, Germany, which was reestablished as the Weimar Republic and was a democracy at the time, was working very hard to decrease the pressure that the Versailles Treaty, which was the end of the First World War, placed on its economy, primarily the demand for war reparations and different changes to the economic system. And they kept working very hard to reject and revise the Versailles Treaty. On the other hand, in France, there was a constant, what can be viewed as a Germanophobia, concerns about the potential of Germany's rise. Therefore, the policy that France was adopting at the time was strong, aggressive security policy that did not accept any types of concessions when it comes to Germany, and persistent pressure, which was intended to prevent, the rise, the increase in the power of Germany. Now, the public in France, which once again reminding you the public is a very important element in a democratic peace theory, was in full support of this aggressive anti-German policy, so much that political leaders in France that thought about shifting away from that aggressive anti-German policy face risk for their own political survival as far as late as 1922. And the occupation of that region, and this is where I'll go to the map to show you, this is the region of northern Europe in this case. This is the Rhineland. Now, there were already French troops in some of that area as part of the post-World War I treaties, but this is the Ruhr area, which we're talking about here, all right? This is the conflict area, the crisis area. They occupy that area also as part of the policy to increase the pressure in Germany and its economy, all right? So that was the crisis itself. Now, the German response was very limited, and it was focused on civil resistance, non-cooperation of the workers in that region, and limited coordinated sabotage type attacks against the occupying forces. Still, there was no large military action by the Germans and no major violence between both sides. And once again, Lane lays out the explanation based on realist arguments. What he says is that the main reason for the lack of strong response by the Germans was their weak military and financial capabilities, so they could not really mount such a campaign against the French, which were more powerful. On the other hand, or in addition to that, France was displaying in those actions clear strategic power-based motivations in their policy, as they wanted to establish themselves as a regional power in Northern Europe and increase their economic gain. So this is clear-cut resources, military capabilities, strategic incentives. All of this is a realist view, which provides explanation to the actions of both countries. And we cannot really rely on the arguments by the democratic peace, because primarily the public in France, as I told you a few minutes ago, was first of all, is very suspicious of Germany and was very supportive of taking those kinds of aggressive actions. So the public was not the reason that a lack of conflict, that's what happened in reality. It was actually more of a strategic and realist types explanation. And that's the main point that Lane provides here as an alternative explanation to why two democracies in this case did not go into war. Okay, so as I said, if you want to read more about that, we have research from the last 10 years. We have research from last year. This is studied for almost 30 years now. If you're interested, you're more than welcome to read more. Reminding you again to make sure you submit the survey by Wednesday, and no office hours this week. So if you need anything, just send me an email and we can set something up. With that, I am done for today, and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.